Today's theme is broadly around imperialism and the clinic, and we're very lucky to have two excellent speakers who approach this issue in unique ways. Each will speak for about half an hour, and then that'll leave some time for discussion at the end, just to let you know that the event tonight is being recorded. Before we turn to our speakers, I'd like to hand over to my colleague at the London Learning Cooperative, Frank McGuinness, who's going to speak a bit about our vision, about how this clinical practice might work and what it might mean. Frank is a barrister at Garden Court Chambers and a member of the executive committee of the trade union United Voices of the World. Frank.
Thanks, Luke. My talk tonight is called Migrant Workers' Power, the Imperial State and the Financial Architecture of Mental Health Service Provision, or How to Build Communism in the Mental Health Services Sector. I'll try to keep it to under 20 minutes. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. The class struggle between labour and capital provides the starting point for this talk. If there is a war, then we aim to split our audience, inviting you to choose a side. Now, I'm not a mental health professional, so I defer to my co-panelists' greater expertise and data experience as a practicing barrister in England and Wales, as a current executive committee member and former head of the legal department at the trade union United Voices of the World, and my grasp, such as it is, of Marxist theory. Now, the radical left is sometimes criticized for trying to think about too many things at once. In this talk, we're theorizing only three things. Part one explores theories about how to organize workers and workplaces. Part two concerns theories of nation states, including critiques of imperialism and anti-imperialism. And in part three, we explore the financial architecture of mental health services as it relates to broader conversations about neoliberalism and financialization. These three theoretical areas inform our practical project. That project aims at the transformation of workplaces along radically egalitarian lines within and beyond the mental health services sector. I'll end my contribution with a sketch of what those three theoretical areas might look like if applied to a concrete clinical practice. Now, this event itself has an architecture, which is to say that it has a form and a structure that we, the organizers, have designed. That structure is built partly on assumptions. We're speaking and writing in the English language, not Irish or Arabic. We're assuming, or we're deciding, that attendance will be limited to those with access to computers and the internet. The event has a financial architecture that anchors the price of a ticket to an attendee's self-reported wealth. That anchor is honesty-based, it's primarily psychological, and it's open to moral hazard. The pricing architecture, in its attempt at radical inclusivity, is microcosmic and prefigurative of the kind of highly accessible, counter-hegemonic clinical practice that we want to build. We identify and engage with our audiences by reference to the central class conflict animating global politics and the economy. The conflict is between workers and capitalists, between those who sell their labor power for a wage and those who own the means of production. We seek, in the words of Mexican poet and human rights activist Cesar A. Cruz, to disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed. The liberals in the audience, presumably, feel both comforted and disturbed at the same time. One section of the audience is our comrades, our fellow workers and socialists. Another is our enemies, the bosses and the managers they employ. And in between, the liberals who, by refusing to choose a side, thereby attempt to be neutral on a moving train, as Howard Zinn was fond of putting it, and would seem to side with capital whether they admit it to themselves or not. Now, I'd wanted to provide some context to the terminology I'll be using, but the dictates of time have forced me to shorten this section. Suffice it to say that I'll refer throughout to conservatives, liberals, and radicals. That's my grounding framework. Those three categories derive their meaning broadly by reference to their attitude to the class conflict. The conservative is for capital, the radical is for the international working class, and the liberal aims to manage but never resolve the conflict between the two classes. Part one concerns theories of organizing with workers, in particular so-called migrant workers, against exploitation as a starting point towards developing a more satisfying clinical practice. So for the purposes of part one, our project looks to theories of workers and workplace organizing and theorists in the Italy-centric autonomous tradition of workers' inquiry figure heavily, though we're not uncritical of that tradition's Eurocentric tendencies and the notable general absence of a critique of empire. Those theories of autonomist theories of organizing exist in tension with more orthodox Leninist theories about what the party should look like, what revolutionary discipline means in practice, and what this tension between bottom-up working class autonomy and top-down vanguardist discipline might tell us about how to design and transform workplaces. We also draw on contemporary struggles within and beyond Britain's trade union movement. A pronounced and growing tension now exists between the established trade union Congress affiliated general unions like Unite and GMB on the one hand, and the smaller but more radical and agile base unions like United Voices of the World and the Industrial Workers of Great Britain on the other. Now, Jane McAlevey and the literature that has emerged around her no shortcuts model of organising remains prominent in our approach. At Mental Health Workers Inquiry, we are actively attempting to map the sector, thereby identifying some of the cleavages, problems and contradictions that exist. I'm particularly interested in theorising and exploring the relationship between mental health sector workers and the welfare state, and the impact of financialisation on mental health service provision in both core and periphery. In our engagement with workers' inquiry as a method, we are inspired by and continue to engage with the radical journal Notes from Below. In an article entitled The Workers' Inquiry and Social Composition from January 2018, the editors of Notes from Below explains, quote, "Workers' inquiry is an approach that combines knowledge production with organising. It attempts to create useful knowledges about work, exploitation, class relations, and capitalism from the perspective of workers themselves. There are two forms of workers' inquiry. The first is inquiry from above, involving the use of traditional research methods to gain access to the workplace. The second is inquiry from below, a method that involves co-research, in which workers themselves are involved in leading the production of knowledge. If the conditions exist, the inquiry from below is clearly favourable. The knowledge that is produced from either of these forms of inquiry is useful for understanding capitalism, but also for organising against it," end quote. In the introduction to her 2016 book, No Shortcuts, the esteemed trade union organiser Jane McAlevey says, quote, "My hypothesis is threefold. First, the reason the progressives have experienced a 4-decade decline in the United States is because of a significant and long-term shift away from deep organising and toward shallow mobilising. Second, the split labour and social movement has hampered what little organising has been done. Together, these two trends help to account for the failure of unions and progressive politics, the ongoing shrinking of the public sphere, and unabashed rule by the worst and greediest corporate interests. Third, different approaches to changes lead to different outcomes, often very different outcomes. I discuss 3 broad types of change processes: advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing, although my emphasis, if not my obsessive emphasis, is on the latter 2. Only organizing can effectively challenge the gross inequality of power in the United States," end quote. Now, I now turn to theories of clinical mental health practice itself. I've already said that this is not my area of expertise, but in addition to theories of Freudian psychoanalysis, our starting point is to explore linkages between thinkers such as Wilfred Bion, who theorized an approach to group analysis and group minds on the one hand, and Leninist theories about the party form on the other. In his 2015 book, When the Sun Bursts, The Enigma of Schizophrenia, Christopher Bolas says, quote, "We all live in groups, and the vital groupings of our lives, as small as a family or as large as a nation, all develop their own collective unconscious. Jung's famous phrase refers to how each culture inherits and passes along its own particular social unconscious. Group therapists trained in the models proposed by Bion and A.K. Rice discover how a group of strangers will quickly divide certain functions among them in order to develop the mind of that particular group. The raw experiences of life, love, hate, envy, anxiety, hope, despair, bewilderment, madness, enter the group as powerful emotional states, and the ability to process these will depend on the members of the group forming a collective mind," end quote. From this starting point, I add an imminent critique of bourgeois theories of psychology, starting from Taylorism and Skinner. The capitalist and the capitalist political economy need to treat the worker as a machine that the human resources department must keep well-oiled and economically functional. We examine the relationship between capitalist attitudes towards both mental health and work and explore the way they inform each other. Now, there exists a tension between a political model based on class conflict and an individual approach to individual patients or analysants or clients. And these terms for those people themselves, these terms for the people who experience mental health services are not unproblematic. When I started working at a trade union, I was gently mocked by some of my comrades for calling trade union members clients, and that's a practice that I picked up at the bar. The term comrade has its own connotations and problems, attempting as it does to subsume the individual into a universal collective, namely that of the international working class and its party. Ultimately, we need to think about what it means to care for a class enemy who is paying us to do so. But we also problematize the convenient dichotomy between class enemy and class ally that supposedly separates enemy from friend, and which, by emphasizing the individual, can allow structural forces to recede from view. So to conclude part one, we are thinking about how to organize workers in workplaces in the mental health sector. Part two concerns imperialism in the state. The organizers of Mental Health Workers Inquiry refuse to ignore the disparity between how mental health services operate in the core compared to ex-British colonies like Iraq, Palestine, and Bangladesh. MHWI also need to develop our attitude towards the state, and specifically state institutions like the British National Health Service. Are we organizing primarily in the private sector? And if not, why not? More to the point, what would it mean to apply our approach to existing systems of public provision of mental health services? And how might theory help us to understand how state-run mental health services are financed by imperialism? Lenin's theory of imperialism is grounded in the thinkers Hobson and Hilferding. His theory is primarily a theory of how finance capital emerging from monopolies comes to be invested abroad. A rich tradition of anti-imperialist theory and practice has emerged out of Lenin's essentially economic account of where imperialism comes from. Frantz Fanon's work marries theories of psychoanalysis with those of imperialism, providing a psychoanalytic account of both whiteness and decolonization in French-occupied Algeria. In the famous opening to his book, The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon says, quote, "At whatever level we study it, relationship between individuals, new names for sports clubs, the human admixture at cocktail parties, in the police, on the directing boards of national or private banks, decolonization is quite simply the replacing of a certain species of men by another species of men," end quote. What's particularly relevant for our purposes, and what I will expand on in part three, is the reference to the directing boards of banks. This is one of many liaisons between Lenin's emphasis on finance capital and Fanon's psychological theory of imperialism. W.E.B. Du Bois pioneered a theory of double consciousness to explain the experience of African Americans inhabiting white supremacist spaces. In a recent article for the Materialist Lawyers Group, I applied the concept of double consciousness to the question of the complicity of so-called radical immigration lawyers who, through their legal practice, administer the oppressive, racist, and imperialist structure of the British imperial border. Nadine El-Anani's recently released legal historical analysis, Bordering Britain, brilliantly shows how Britishness, as well as the European project, is virtually coextensive with whiteness and white supremacy. This theory isn't abstract, but it's material, concerning as it does the exclusion of non-white people from the spoils of empire. What might such legal historical insights tell us if we were to apply them to the political economy of mental health provision in imperial cores like Britain, the United States, and colonized Palestine? To conclude part two, our approach to transforming workplaces in the mental health services sector must have a theory and practice that accounts for the disparity between core and periphery, and must actively work to overcome that material inequality. Part three concerns finance and the financial architecture of mental health service provision. In his 2013 book, Profiting Without Producing, How Finance Exploits Us All, Kostas Lapavitsas described the concept of financialization as, quote, "a systemic transformation of advanced capitalist economies, pivoting on changes in the underlying conduct of non-financial enterprises, banks, and households. First, non-financial enterprises have become broadly involved in the realm of finance, often undertaking financial transactions independently. Financialization represents the opening of more space between non-financial enterprises and banks, with a lessening of mutual dependencies among the two. Second, banks have directed their activities toward trading in open financial markets and dealing with households. Third, individuals and households have become heavily implicated in finance in terms of both borrowing, such as for housing and general consumption, and holding assets, such as for pensions and insurance, end quote. Nicholas Shaxson provides a focus on Britain specifically in his 2019 book, The Finance Curse, where he explains, quote, how the first seeds of trouble were sown in the 1950s, an era when Britain lost its empire and when the City of London faced powerful democratic forces at home, which curbed its profits and its power, and which delivered unprecedented growth to other parts of the economy. The city then began to construct a new globalized financial model, which was so successful for the city that some have described its rebirth as the birth of a second British Empire, end quote. Our theory of financialization is also informed by historical experiments in state and worker-led worker ownership, and specifically the Meidner Plan in Sweden and the Lucas Plan in Britain. Finally, it's important to discuss a central work of theory that I've been involved with developing with several others for some years, including Ben Tippett, who's an economist at the University of Greenwich. We call our theory people's private equity. Broadly, PPE consists in finding ways to use existing hyper-capitalist financial mechanisms and private equity in particular to buy up existing companies and transform them along prefigurative socialist and counter-hegemonic lines. That might include a 4-day week with no reduction in pay for workers, one-to-one global pay ratios, democratic and accountable decision-making structures, and worker ownership. Let me conclude part 3 by reminding you all that tonight we took baby steps towards creating a classless event. You were all individually invited to pay what you could afford for a ticket, and you thereby helped collectively to finance this project. We intend to find a way of collectively financing global mental health services so that no one is excluded from them. And so to my overall conclusion, what I've just been talking about is a theory, a 3-pronged theory, if you will. If we can unify that theory with a practice, then we'll have a radical counter-hegemonic praxis, a unity of theory and practice. Let me finish my contribution to tonight's event with a sketch of mental health workers' inquiry and what our emerging theory might look like in practice. The problem is overwork. It's people being viewed and treated like machines. The problem is underfunding and austerity in the public health service sector. It's workers feeling a depressing and soul-crushing sense of alienation and purposelessness. The problem is capitalist class relations that require one class of people to exploit another class of people in pursuit of profit. These problems manifest in the mental health sector in specific ways, some of which I've already outlined. My sketch of our modest contribution to the solution to that problem centers on 2 things. Firstly, on building radically different worker-controlled organizations from the bottom up to provide mental health services. But secondly, and crucially, on developing an aggressive private equity fund or related financial vehicle that interoperates with a militant campaign to increase trade union density and workers' power, thereby gaining ownership and control of existing workplaces within and beyond the mental health services sector, and thereby contributing to the wider class struggle to transform the balance of class forces and the state in pursuit of a demand for, or perhaps a vision of, a classless society free from exploitation. In a famous poem, James Connolly said, "Some men faint-hearted ever seek our programme to retouch, and will insist whene'er they speak that we demand too much. 'Tis passing strange, yet I declare such statements give me mirth, for our demands most moderate are, we only want the earth." More concretely, we've begun to create a clinical practice defined by a highly accessible pricing structure. We intend for that practice to intervene in and help to sustain the globally embattled welfare state. We want the workers in our organisation to be paid the same wage regardless of the kind of labour they perform, pursuant to a one-to-one global pay ratio. We want the workers to work a 4-day week with no reduction in pay, and from there to shorten the working week even further. And having shown that this model works and is not only sustainable but better than the current alternative, we want to study and then redeploy hyper-capitalist financial vehicles, twisting them against their current purpose of profit maximization and using them instead to transform existing mental health sector workplaces from profit production and extraction factories into places of care, sustenance, and international humanistic solidarity. That is my sketch of the plan. If you have any comments or if you'd like to be involved with it, then you are most welcome to reach out to me or us, whoever you are. Thanks for your time and attention.
Well, thank you very much for that, Frank. There's a lot to think about in there and a lot to unpick. I'm going to turn to our guest speakers now, and I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Lara Shiha, who is a licensed clinical psychologist, faculty member at the George Washington University Professional Psychology Program, and a policy analyst. She's currently co-authoring a book with Stephen Shiha, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Theory and Practice in Palestine. She's the secretary of the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology and the chair of the Teachers Academy of the American Psychoanalytic Association. She's also on the advisory board of the USA Palestine Mental Health Network and to Psychoanalysis for Pride. Over to you, Lara.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to Susanna, who's doing the tech work and not on camera, making the magic work. I appreciate it. Luke and Frank for helping us do this, and then Carolyn, of course, great to meet you. I want to start off by locating myself. I'm talking to you all on the occupied land of the Pamunkey people, currently known as Williamsburg, Virginia. So belly of the colonial beast, as I often say, just about 2 miles from Jamestown settlement. So that's important for me at any point, particularly within the field of psychology and psychoanalysis that deals with selfhood and people's identities and how they come to that. Oftentimes that's disavowed and completely forgotten, so that's important. But also in today's world, in the Zoom world, where we're sort of living this disembodied experience, just to sort of locate ourselves and make sure that I pay also respect to the custodial folks of this land that were displaced by colonialism. So I also am an Arab psychoanalytic clinician, and I work from a decolonial lens. So everything that I will be talking about today kind of emerges from that and emerges from my own lived experience and how I've come to think about it. So I'll be walking you through that. Again, the locating ourselves, let's just go back to that point, is central because psychology, and I'm a psychoanalytic psychologist, so I talk about psychology overall, but with particular emphasis on psychoanalysis within that, that especially when practiced within a colonial framework without attending to the coloniality of that space and what it displaces, has the ability to dislocate us, right? And the central working pieces of the struggles that challenges folks have. So for example, what I mean by this is that psychology and psychoanalysis historically tend to focus on the individual encounter. And that individual encounter, rather than placing an individual within a larger structure that in and of itself within structures of coloniality and imperialism, often falls on fault lines that work in service of capitalism, neoliberal subjectivity, and in service of imperial power. So we come to understand as everything located within the individual themselves, and structural pieces, even if they're on the periphery or on the radar, are often displaced or thought of as secondary, or at worst a defense against what folks' experience actually might be. In locating the problem within the individual, what it also has the ability to do is displace sociopolitical history in reality, right? Indigenous scholars like Gone and Braveheart Yellow Horse would particularly bring our attention to racial traumas. So how folks' symptomatology shows up ends up being a problem of disorder that is located within the human, rather than looking at the racialized history of coloniality and the structures of oppression that continue, and that our clinic might actually shore up rather than work against. Something that Frank started to sort of speak about at the beginning. It also works on, when we work within a colonial model and we disavow that reality, what I would call non-negotiable starting points, right? That we do work within colonial systems, that imperialism exists, that oftentimes we live in the belly of that. If we don't attend to those things, we tend to work on foreclosed possibilities, especially with regard to health and wellness, and how we even conceive of what Jasper Puar might talk about, ability or debility, and how these systems actually work to create debility and disorder and perpetual disorder. When I talk about, what I mean when I say foreclosed possibilities is that everything already is as it is. That's what we might think about what ideology does as well, right? And as it will be, even when we're working toward an endpoint and when we work within a framework. You know, when you think about treatment modalities, there's always foreclosed possibilities of when we think about particular ways of health and wellness that we're imagining, even throughout the process of the treatment, that we're imagining a particular endpoint that falls within normative lines of what we understand to be health and wellness that themselves are propped up by a colonial or a coloniality or a colonial system. Versus working on a process. It's not about the endpoint, a capitalist endpoint, or that there's a product at the end of which we will get to a foreclosed opportunity, but rather a process and fluidity, which if we look at psychoanalysis specifically, tends to speak to the health that comes from fluidity, but very rarely actually practices that. So even in training, we talk about sort of fluidity as being indicative of health, and then we end up thinking about things in a very rigid way within prescribed parameters that shore up capitalist tendencies and the colonial state. And finally, when we function, we don't locate ourselves within a colonial structure or you know, at the hands of the sort of violence of imperialism, we disavow our own complicity in people's suffering. So oftentimes we position ourselves as clinicians who are not also complicit within these systems and potentially having the ability to enact a lot of violence against folks, particularly those who have historically been disenfranchised and oppressed by systems, and psychology being a primary one of those. So we always imagine it as like it's out there, right? Even when we are focusing on analyzing structures, we sometimes miss the fact of implicating ourselves and how this might be happening in our own clinics, particularly if we think about the Fanonian idea of us being agents of the state, right? How can we not be? If you think about, and this might get to Frank's point of like looking at the NHS or the sort of healthcare system, public healthcare systems, when we are vetted by the state, when we are licensed by the state, how do we not enact directly or indirectly some of the violences that are involved in that? In the context of the United States, for example, there's talk that's being pushed by the American Psychoanalytic Association about us having primary roles in deciding whether or not folks can have firearms, and how that is a very slippery slope into us, you know, becoming cops, if not cops ourselves, extensions of that arm of the state that always disproportionately falls on folks who have been the most historically disenfranchised and who might, you know, and even within their right to bear arms, by the way, against a oppressive state. So let me talk a little bit about how I came to be interested in this. A lot of folks will ask me, why psychoanalysis? Why are you interested in this to begin with? And how did you come to, from within psychoanalysis, to talk about it from a decolonial lens, or to start to really investigate in a very rigorous way the ways in which we enact violence from an ideology of psychoanalysis, which comes to be understood as a dominant sort of structure from which we understand it, which always is a stand-in. It's a stand-in for, we were talking right before the talk, right, is a stand-in for a white supremacist, cis, hetero experience, from our theories to our practice, to the way that we train, to the way that people are inculcated into training institutes, and the way that their bodies and their minds and their thoughts are disciplined in line with a certain way, theoretical framework. So as an Arab clinician and as an immigrant to the United States, I've always had a struggle between theory, psychoanalysis, that I particularly found liberating. That there's language that speaks to structural issues. We were talking about this also, the language of structure. When we talk about structural change, even when it's talked about on a psychic level, we have the language around it to speak to the complexities, and it has the capacity to attend to complexities of experience that otherwise, in my mind, felt flattened and unidimensional in other spaces. The conflict that I experienced, and one of my dearest friends and colleagues from graduate school, Maxine Wigway, is on here, so she will know what I mean when I said is that what I came to learn was the practice of psychoanalysis, which felt very divorced from the realities that folks presented with, and even sometimes in contrast to the actual theory itself. So this was very specific to me as an anti-Zionist immigrant in post 9/11 United States, where anytime I sort of took up these issues or tried to ask psychoanalysis to bend and expand in the ways that it always promises us it can do, the response would be, well, don't make this political, or you're racializing this, or God forbid you talk about Zionism. Of course, that just sort of melts everybody down. So there seemed to be something there for me, right? So I started to get interested in what it happens, and I've talked about it elsewhere, where what happens when there's a collapse of analyzable space. That was a clue to me that something was going on, and that actually is what intrigued me further. So I started to wonder, as I realized this, I started to wonder about my own role in patching up and creating good neoliberal subjects, the way that we are trained to sort of, when I relieve symptomatology, am I also functioning as an arm of the state to sort of patch people back up to fundamentally broken systems that otherwise their symptoms are giving us a clue these larger aspects of being and functioning are not working, partially because we continue to suffer every single day, whether it's within capitalism or within these structures that are non-normative but sold as normative. And is my work asking them or teaching them how to attend to this and become complacent with these larger structures rather than towards liberation, truly? I also started to wonder about how ideology and colonialism has the ability to make the pathological normal and the normal pathological, especially if the referential point is always that of the colonizer and in service of an imperial machine. So this might be what Fanon was talking about when he says that the colonized are always presumed guilty. If that's the starting point of everything, how can I not think about pathological becoming normal and the normal becoming pathological in service of these larger hegemonic structures? And pathology comes to be understood within that. And then the biggest thing was that what I realized was when I started to work with folks is that this shit's real. Like their presentation is real. And psychoanalysis often flexes its intrapsychic and psychic muscles, but not the reality principle muscles, which was really fascinating to me because those are like two sides of psychoanalysis that exist simultaneously. But what clinicians oftentimes ended up over focusing on was the intrapsychic, which to me felt there was something defensive happening. If you're disavowing an entire arm of your theory itself, what is so pressing about that from a defensive maneuver that would allow you to completely forget that a reality principle is there, which would include sociopolitical process and the outside world and the context that has on our actual clinical spaces? What I arrived at with this, and this is the part of my talk that I want to talk about, is the myth of safety, right? So psychoanalysis particularly tends to sell itself and to promise that our room and our office and space exists outside of systems of oppression. That if you can just find yourself into the office of an analyst, that everything is going to be okay within that space, apart from the enormous grandeur and sort of arrogance that that presents. It also is a fallacy, right? That the second that we close the door, that everything else is outside of that, it promises something about people's ability to tap out of their experience and about psychoanalysis to deliver on that promise as well. And what's embedded in that is that we can offer safety, right? It's another fancy way, I think, of saying purity and also disavowing our own responsibility in the suffering of others, including that of the folks who come into our office and who we work with. But it's also promoting a split between the self and the social, right? Sort of saying and reifying, whether directly or indirectly, that there is a split between the social and the personal, the psychic and the political, and how a person comes to live within that, and how we might start to understand that, how that has particular disproportionate effects on folks who already have marginalized identities and live on what we might call the peripheries, right? So Stephen Portuguese, in his article about the politics of neutrality, mentioned that between 1920 and 2003, the word psychic reality had been used 1,700 times in articles in psychoanalysis, while political reality was only used 39 times. That's between 1920 and 2003. And when it was used, it was to talk about how psychoanalysis had been thwarted in certain places, like Argentina, for example, when there was a coup and psychoanalysts were sort of rounded up. So it wasn't even talked about within this context of the clinical space. More on Portuguese, he was saying, this is a quote from him, psychoanalytic clinical practice was discussed as if it were and should be impervious to political influences, and as if its therapeutic and institutional practices were not constrained by the cultural ideologies in which they exist. What does that mean? Basically, in my experience, I have been told this is not psychoanalysis so many times when I'm presenting about stuff. The implication of which is you're a bad clinician if you take into account the outside world, right? This is particularly the case in training, when you're inculcated into a certain way and a certain purity of training. And we might think about how trainees not only might find difficulty in breaking that framework, but also in the pressures they feel to stay true to the parameters in which they're taught in order to be looked at as competent and as upholding the pure intent of psychoanalysis. It might not be a hard stretch to think about how that falls differently and lands differently on different people, particularly those who already have to put in such effort to be taken seriously within professional spaces in the racialized and sort of racialized history and gendered history of that type of thinking. So the other thing that I wanted to call to mind that really brought me into thinking this way, but also gives us a curiosity around why we are here. Here we are in 2020 talking about this. Why is it that now we are talking about this? And it still is a question that we grapple with. It still is a question that clinicians such as myself and others are sort of fighting within institutions to have folks take seriously, to take up as an issue of psychoanalysis, to take up as central to theory of psychoanalysis versus outside of it, or an addendum or appendage to. And I think that it's really a matter, if we're talking about history, is a disconnect between the radical roots of psychoanalysis and the practice that we see today. I'm just going to mention a couple examples that sort of help frame this. For example, Elizabeth Danto has a book called Freud's Free Clinics, and she talked about how psychoanalysis began actually as a radical critique, right, of what Portuguese says is the illness-producing effects of social suppression and the psychological repression of human sexuality. In this book, she talks about a history in which Freud and his comrades at the time actually presented coupons to folks to be seen in free clinics that were entirely funded, first privately by that group of psychoanalysts, with the expressed intention of access in mind. That folks, not everybody had the same sort of access to care, not everybody had the same sort of wealth, and so they created these clinics, but then also followed through with coupons and then advocated for the state to take that that option over. So in the end, the state was the one who gave the coupons to folks, and they were seen by these really famous, what we might see as leading folks in psychoanalysis. But this was on purpose. Harris and Brock talk about the Rundbrief of Fennekel and his folks. So they say, this is a quote from them, Fennekel dialectically combined politics and psychology to analyze interwar social phenomena, ranging from the increase in character neuroses to the political conservatism of the German working class. Believing in scientific progress through collective intellectual work, Fennekel pursued this project in collaboration with a small group of Marxist Freudians who had studied together in Berlin and were then dispersed by Hitler's rise to power. This is end quote. This is from Harrison Brock, who is giving a history of this. What's amazing about this group is that they wrote to each other every few weeks for 11 years. And they formed this sort of zine within themselves as a caucus, a political caucus. And this is entirely missing from the history of psychoanalysis, particularly training, clinical psychoanalysis. We're not taught in institutes about this radical history, particularly the Marxist Freudian link there. This group was specifically called itself a Marxist Freudian opposition to psychoanalysis particularly the psychoanalysis, which at the time was a revisionist, a neo-Freudian revisionism within the International Psychoanalytic Association. Their goals were very specific. They spelled this out in their letters to each other. They were both political and theoretical. Number one was to protect Marxists, especially in clinical and academic spaces. They realized that journals were not printing articles, for example, where analysts were explicitly political and Marxist in their analysis and talked about the material realities of their patients' lives. They also wanted a move toward political action. This is really important. So when we're talking about this initiative we're taking up right now, political action is a part of that. These analysts at the time saw that as part of their duty as well. So they wanted to push against the Nazification of German psychoanalytic circles and associations, and push the International Psychoanalytic Association to take expressed positions on political aspects of the world. So they did not think that they belonged just in the clinic. They thought actually part of our job as analysts is to be present in these spaces and take a outwardly focused and outwardly facing position on social processes. And then finally, it was to develop a Marxist psychoanalytic reading of the psyche and the self. So they did have an image of how can we move towards a psychoanalysis that actually has an explicitly Marxist material analysis of folks' position between themselves and their psyche. The last thing I say, and this is, I'm guilty of this when I talk about psychoanalysis, and I think psychoanalysis more and more is guilty of this, is it's a decidedly Eurocentric and with a very strong USA specific implementation, right? So when we talk about training, we're often talking about the ways in which American psychoanalysis has taken up these issues, which tends to be much more conservative than other parts of the world, but it is still very sort of influential in the way that psychoanalysis is talked about and seen. Within this, when we see it from this lens, and when we recognize that the hegemonic practice and thought process of psychoanalysis, and I would say outside of academia, right? I'm talking about clinical psychoanalysis. Academia sometimes has a little bit more space for folks to take up issues within psychoanalysis, but the clinical practice is what I'm focusing on, that it begs the question of the necessity of examining coloniality and imperialism as being baked into our theory, practice, and thinking. And Jacobi actually, and this is a quote from them, when it came to the United States, this is why the centrality of sort of the United States in this process and in the move towards conservatism and move away from the public sector into the clinical space. Jacobi says, and this is a quote, "The medical doctors and neo-Freudians threatened to tame psychoanalysis, streamlining it so as to fit it neatly into their offices. They stripped it of its cultural and political implications." And I think we're seeing the lasting effects of that, right? What Dorothy Holmes might call a wrecking effect of that, that when you, and this is the, I think what Frank was talking about, the liberalization of our practice, that is a very sort of liberal approach to things, is to taming it, to be afraid and threatened by the radical elements that are within a practice. And the best way to do that is to locate it within a contained space that ends the moment somebody opens the door and goes on to their regular life, right? It exists just within our clinical spaces. It exists just within their own minds, their own psyche. And then the onus, of course, also is on the individual to contain that and to not leak, rather than to see the sort of porousness of oppressive structures, both in a bidirectional aspect. So I will end with what to do. A lot of times I get this question, okay, this is nice and fancy, but like, what are we doing, right? Like, what do you do? On the one hand, I wanted to warn us against that question, because I think in some ways that's a bad faith question. I think folks, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color, have been saying for ages what we should do, and maybe we're just tuning in now. So on the one hand, I want to accept and acknowledge that our field has been told what to do for a long time and has not done it. On the other hand, I do want to offer something for us to sort of grapple with, and perhaps we can speak a little bit more in the Q&A section about ideas that other folks have. But one of the things, you know, and sort of easy fix, I would say, is rethink fee structures, sort of like Frank was saying, is to offer, for example, psychoanalysis or clinical work for Black, Indigenous, and people of color for free, right? That with the explicit idea of a colonial and capitalist model, that we can understand it within a framework of them being disenfranchised from access from legacies of coloniality and oppression by white supremacist structures. This isn't just like haphazard. This isn't a diversification of our field to say, oh, if we just bring in Black and brown bodies, then we become good clinical citizens. It's with an explicit intention to offset the decentering process that has happened from colonialism and capitalism that disproportionately amass wealth for certain folks and not for others, and then affects access as well. You know, working on sliding fee scale and pro bono, I do this a lot, but I want to caution us also about being stuck just there. It's important that when we talk about what to do, that we also consider ways to recalibrate exploitative systems, right? The mental health workers inquiry is an example of that. This is precisely where we belong, right? Taking up these issues in a real way to affect structural change and not just recapitulate individuals' practices. In our own practice, I'm working on a sliding fee scale, I work pro bono. Those exist in individual spaces. It's not a stance that we take as a field. It's one that somebody can decide to do or not to do. So I'm suspicious of the larger structural change that has the ability to do, even though in individual cases, that is really important. The other thing is that I will say is we belong in this fight. We need to speak to it and we need to theorize it. A lot of folks, particularly clinicians and my students, are always shocked about when clinicians are activists as well. And that shock speaks to something. The reason why they're shocked is because we don't represent ourselves as belonging in this fight. We represent ourselves as belonging in the clinic. I'm not saying that's it. There's plenty of wonderful folks doing work, but I'm talking about a field position, an ethical imperative as a field to say this is our place, this is what we should be talking to. These are the systems that we should be dismantling together. It is our fight to talk about the carceral state, to talk about abolition, to talk about freeing Palestine. This is our space to be in. And so to that, kind of like what Frank was initially saying, is choose a side. I think a lot of times clinicians, I end up seeing a call for nuance from clinicians particularly, where they weaponize their theoretical ability to hold space, and they don't recognize that that's actually a consensual process that you go into with a patient. That is not your responsibility outside the clinical space. To the contrary, what I would say is that splitting under the pressure of oppression actually loses its pathology. It forfeits its pathology. I find it far more pathological in a context like today's world, particularly with fascism on the rise, for us not to take a position. That's particularly what Fennikel and their colleagues were calling on us to do back when, and that is what I think we need to do now. And we need to be comfortable with taking strong positions and saying, this is what my position is. As psychoanalysis, this is where we lie, on what side we lie, and to resist and to fight against anybody who might say that is splitting, or resist and fight against folks who want to co-opt us into dialogue processes that always task the most disenfranchised with the most labor to do to reach that process of negotiation. I would say we create our own institutions. That's another, that's one of the things we're doing, and stop working within systems. The politics of refusal is a really strong one. We see it in our patients all the time. This is resistance with a capital R. I would say it's resistance that is necessary. And that might be, for example, not working within systems that, for example, Black sites, what a surprise, that we should not be working with, or military psychologists, or working within folks who are in historic Palestine but are Zionists, or are working for dialogue groups within those spaces. That when to see ourselves as lending credibility to fundamentally oppressive systems when we work within them. So the politics of refusal being a primary space that we should think about functioning in. The other aspect of it is mutual aid and membership contribution to an explicitly anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, decolonial clinical method and spaces. I think there are wonderful models for that. I'm going to ask a comrade who's in the audience, Juliet, to speak very briefly to a model that she and her comrades have brought together in New York, particularly Queens, I believe. And that might give us a little bit of a taste of what that actually means when we can reconceive of a non-hierarchical model of practice in motion. So I will hand it over to Juliet if you're there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, okay, great. Should I come on camera? Let me see. Okay. There we go. Hi, y'all, and thank you so much for inviting me on here and for introducing me. I'm really excited to be here. And your reminder at the beginning of your talk, Laura, is such an important one to kind of locate yourself, and so I want to do that now as well. The practice that I'm a part of is Alliance Psychological Services of New York, and we are located on Lanai Lenape Indigenous land and in a very rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. And we are 3 white folks. So that's really important, I think, to keep in mind as I'm discussing, what our radical model is and how we're attempting to kind of deconstruct that in ways that we aren't. So I guess the main features that I can speak to, just to sort of give a broad overview, where we think about things in terms of like worker care, client care, and then the systemic forms of violence and all those constraints that they place upon us. So and all the forms of violence that we kind of perpetrate and are complicit with through those systems. So we, I guess I'll talk about sort of the way that we've set up our practice in terms of the workers first. So we are worker owned. I'm using air quotes because there are a lot of laws that prevent us from formally incorporating as a worker-owned cooperative that is a healthcare business. And the reason for that is mainly because it's I guess to protect clients from like outside interests, even though that's awfully hypocritical, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, it's been quite a difficult thing to find a workaround to formally form a worker-owned cooperative that includes both clinicians with different licenses and an administrative worker owner that is really invaluable to our practice. So the 3 of us have basically been doing a lot of emotional labor to try and create non-hierarchy, and we're also in the process that is turning out to be really difficult and expensive of finding a workaround of like sort of creating a management company that can kind of own different entities that will then kind of collectively be formed together. It's very, very confusing and might not be applicable to other areas, but that's sort of where we're at in that formal process. But we all pay ourselves the same hourly wage. We were at $30 an hour. We are now at $40 an hour. We just kind of raised that. I feel like it's important to just be transparent about that. That's sort of where we're at in terms of thinking about what's a fair and livable yet balanced wage that we can do to kind of manage that and also keep costs down and make things more accessible for clients. We don't actually have benefits. We don't get benefits like healthcare paid for by the business. So that's something that we're trying to work on. That's just really important here in the U.S. because we don't get it otherwise. I imagine it would be a difficult wage to live on, for example, if I had children. So it's by no means perfect or totally accessible. But I think it's progress where we're at. And the main benefit that I find of working is at APS is just that we have a really collaborative way of doing things. We do a lot of emotional labor that has been, I think, the most significant part of any, I mean, aside from kind of creating the formal structures and setting fees and everything and wages, it's the emotional labor that we do and kind of our commitment to, to eradicating hierarchy, not only just in the formal structure of what we're doing, but also in just our day-to-day micro interactions. So we really frequently process how we're interacting with one another in the workplace, and how power is operating at any given moment, both with each other and with our clients. I guess with that, I can move on sort of to client care. We experimented when I first came on, and we kind of decided to, like, let's really do this. Let's take this from being a private practice to an individually owned private practice to a worker co-op. We wanted to try a pay what you can model, and essentially we couldn't make that happen. We thought we would try setting, we were like, okay, if our wages are at the time $30 an hour, let's do like maybe $45 for a session. Our costs were relatively low in terms of our overhead budget. We thought that if we could kind of have like a bottom that was, pretty below market rate, and then at the top end, just kind of see what, people could afford and kind of see what would happen. I think people were very honest about what they could pay for. And we were in a working class area, and there's not enough wealth there to kind of have, like, we thought it would be sort of, maybe there's a redistribution thing if we make the window for sliding scale really broad, but there's just, it ended up being that most people could kind of only pay around the bottom end of the scale, and that means that we couldn't have people who are paying $0 a session, which is what a lot of people need if they don't have insurance. So the main way that we've been able to make things accessible is through being paneled with Medicaid, and that has its pros and cons, of course. But as it is right now, I see clients for the bottom end of my sliding scale had to increase to keep us operational. So now it's like between $70 a session out of pocket, if people are paying out of pocket, if they don't have insurance, or if they don't have insurance that works with me, and then up to, I have a couple of wealthy clients who pay like $150 a session, and those, it's been interesting to kind of have really open conversations about where we're at. I think us being a lot more transparent about what we're trying to do with setting our fees and what our constraints are has created a really different relationship, I think, between us and clients. I want to be kind of self-critical. I think maybe I'm making an assumption there. I think my hope is that, and my perception is that it has created a different relationship where that both the clients and us are kind of understanding ourselves as subjects under capitalism. And that kind of brings a critical awareness and a transparency to our very first interaction when we are discussing fee. And I found that to be really, really beneficial in my experience to the relationship. I think we're hoping that as we get more worker owners aboard, we can continue to revisit this dream of having a pay what you can model. I think it's a work in progress. I think as we continue to draw more resources from other comrades and to get more inspiration from people like y'all, we're going to figure out how to make our fee structures more and more radical. We think a lot about different ways to provide care, maybe a team-based model. How can we maybe interact with radical mutual aid efforts in the area? that are kind of running in a totally free way. So we have a lot that we're considering, and I think more than like a model that we have to offer, although we do hope to kind of like continually put out information once we've condensed it all to like share that information, make it more readily available. Yeah, we don't have quite like the big picture or a model to present yet, but we have sort of a process that we're in that I do feel really great about sharing, and kind of opening up to feedback and critique, and to sort of grow this community effort. So thanks so much for having me. I've exceeded my time.
Thank you so much, Juliet. And I think what you're saying is really important, and that's why I wanted to wrap up with this sort of offer potentials that otherwise are foreclosed, right? That particularly in the context of the United States, that a practice like yours exists because you all thought, you kept saying like a workaround, how can we create something that is outside the realm of what is expected of us, and that is a process rather than an endpoint. So I really appreciate it, and thank you so much all. I'm looking forward to continuing and answering any questions that come up in the Q&A.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you both very much, and thanks, Lara. That was a really fascinating talk, and a call to arms, really. And thanks for reminding us about the radical roots of psychoanalysis, and how the liberal conservative culture of psychoanalysis today is very much at odds with that. I'm going to turn now to our next speaker. That's Dr. Carolyn Lawbender. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies, and director of the BA in Childhood Studies at the University of Essex. She also serves as the book reviews editor for Psychoanalysis and History. Her current monograph project, Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Clinic, theorizes how the psychoanalytic clinic became a site of experimental political theorization and action throughout Britain and its post-colonies in the 20th century. Carolyn.
Great. Thank you so much, Luke, for the invitation and for the introduction. I'd like to begin by thanking my co-panelists as well. This has been an already very interesting and kind of, it's a treat of a conversation for me to have, since I my work is intellectual history, and it's kind of critical thinking about psychoanalysis and histories of psychoanalysis, but I work in a oftentimes very clinical department. So it's really enjoyable conversation for me to get to participate in with you all right now. So my confession is that this is the first public lecture that I'll be doing on Zoom, and so I'm going to try and share my screen with you all and hope that it goes very well, and hope that if it does not, you will all have some charity for me. Let's see. Yes, indeed. Okay, here we go. So as Luke said, and as I just said, I'm a kind of critical theorist. I'm a non-clinician, which I feel like is an important kind of descriptor in this conversation where we're all differently located. I work kind of between intellectual history, feminist and decolonial critical thought. I guess those are my primary locators. And so this talk will be reflective of a kind of more historical orientation to clinical practice, nevertheless. All right. It is May in Scotland. The year is 1941, and Melanie Klein, like many other London-based psychoanalysts, had just fled the daily London blitzkrieg by moving north. While in Scotland, Klein began the analysis of a, quote, very unusual boy of 10, who she would come to call Richard. Klein saw Richard 6 times a week for a total of 93 sessions from April 28th to August 23rd, 1941. The notes that Klein recorded from this analysis would eventually come together in the form of Narrative of a Child analysis, one of the longest single case histories ever recorded, clocking in at just shy of 500 pages. Renowned for more than its length, Narrative remains a well-known text among clinicians and psychoanalytic historians alike. As clinicians like Donald Meltzer and Hannah Siegel have established, it provides one of the most textured looks at Klein's, quote, controversial clinical technique. At the same time, historical scholars like Michal Shapira and Mike Roper show how it offers a fascinating look at the way that 20th century mind sciences responded to the exigencies of war. Yet what is frequently overlooked in most clinical and critical treatments of this case is the extensive archive of artwork that Richard produced alongside of and often during his analysis. In his 90-some analytic sessions, Richard created no fewer than 74 images, which in typically Kleinian fashion detail scenes of attack, invasion, bombardment, war, and especially pertinent to my discussion today, empire. For Klein, Richard's zealous production of military images was indispensable for her work in mapping her then emergent theory of paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions. Yet at no point does she, or do any of the scholars following her, engage with the geopolitical contours of these images, which bring the wartime politics of imperial expansion into the clinical relation. In this paper, I thus consider the politicality of the image in the clinic, looking specifically at the dozen or so drawings Richard made of what he forebodingly hailed the empire. By situating these images within the so-called wider social stage of wartime Europe, I explore how Richard's art reveals the entanglement of psychic life with social history, providing a visual example of how the political organization of empire lives in the mind. I argue that these images speak to the existence of what I call a latent political unconscious, a concept that names how the unconscious is shaped and populated by geopolitical as much as private familial structures and events. Through this theory of the political unconscious, I offer a close reading of Richard's drawings, showing how these abstract, non-representational imperial cartographies participate in a broader conversation about the viability and desirability of empire in the 20th century. Combining post-colonial critical theory with clinical material, I suggest that Richard's empires allow us to think critically and clinically with empire in mind. Okay, so according to Klein, when Richard first came for treatment, he had been struggling with severe anxieties and phobias for 2 years, since the outbreak of World War II. He was terrified of other children, unable to attend school, inhibited in learning, and frequently subject to depression. Although Klein observed that he had, quote, precocious artistic sensibilities and a great love of nature and music, these interests were often stifled by his anxious concern for his mother's well-being, his paranoid fear of other children, his obsessive interest in the daily developments of the war, Every day he read 4 newspapers, listened to the radio about the progressive updates on the war, and fervently tracked Hitler's advance across the continent. When, at the outset of their first session, Klein asked Richard to discuss some of the, quote, difficulties that caused him to be brought in for analysis, what Richard gave by way of explanation was an expansive description of national conflict. Quote, he also thought much about the war. Of course, he knew that the Allies were going to win, and he was not particularly worried. But was it not awful what Hitler did to people, particularly the terrible things he did to the Poles? Did he mean to do the same over here? But he felt confident that Hitler would be beaten. While speaking about Hitler, he went to have a look at the large map hanging on the wall, end quote. In a move that would become emblematic of the whole analysis, Richard responds to Klein's request that he map his psychological difficulties by instead providing a cartography of war. In his drawings, in his play, and in his speech, Richard would continue to bring the political events occurring throughout Europe into his daily psychoanalytic sessions, drawing everything from the Battle of Crete and the naval expeditions of the warships Bismarck and Nelson, to Switzerland's precarious neutrality and Germany's gluttonous expansion. He brought his own set of toy battleships with him to most sessions and used the art supplies that Klein provided to create dozens of drawings that depicted air, sea, and railway attack, as well as the constantly shifting national borders of the empire. Unlike most of Klein's other child analyses, in which her famous play technique focused more on children's embodied enactments, Richard's case notably included numerous drawings, which laminated the political with the psychological. As seen even in Richard's initial recourse to the physical map hanging on the wall of the consulting room, the image, and I would add the imperial image, would come to function as a key medium of communication throughout their analysis. The first drawings that Richard produced were completed in his 12th session, roughly 2 weeks into the analysis, and those are the ones you see right here. At the start of this session, Richard noticed that Klein had brought with her a number of art supplies. Eagerly taking up a pencil, Richard began 2 drawings, both featuring an assortment of German U-boats, along with the real British battleships, the Salmon, the Truant, and the Sunfish. In the 3 sessions that followed, Richard developed these preliminary sketches into a full-color series in which the fleet of Black British and German warships engage in combat around, and sometimes with, various yellow sea creatures, including fish, starfish, and an enigmatic character Richard called Octopus Mummy. And Octopus Mummy is right here, if you can see her. When he finished these drawings, Richard explained, quote, that there was an attack going on, but he did not know who would attack first, the Salmon or the German U-boat, end quote. Interpreting these images became the focus of this analytic session, as Klein encouraged Richard to associate the geopolitical conflict depicted in the drawings with the principally familial conflict that, she suggested, they unconsciously expressed. Quote, Mrs. K interpreted that the British represented his own family, who he not only loved and wanted to protect, but also wished to attack, end quote. For Richard, such an interpretation was deeply offensive, not because it dealt a blow to family affections, but rather because it was an affront to his patriotism. Throughout the analysis, Richard and Klein debated the representational capacity of the images he created. Through the image, Richard's analysis blurred the line between the internal and the external, the personal and the political, the psychological and the world historical. Now, to the uninitiated, it might seem hardly surprising that a child in 1941, whose brother was enlisted in the British Army and whose house in London had already been bombed, would be preoccupied by world events. However, for Klein, this persistent interest in conflict, destruction, attack, and Hitler himself bespoke the internal rather than external dynamics of attack and repair. Klein interpreted Richard's keen interest in international political conflict as a symptomatic manifestation of a deeper and more fundamental psychic conflict. While Richard drew battleships, bombs, and scenes of naval assault, Klein rejoined by highlighting the threat posed by, quote, Daddy's bad Hitler penis, the endangered terrain of, quote, Mummy's poisoned body, and Richard's own fantasied attacks on the, quote, combined parent figure. For Klein, Richard's drawings acted as a seamless substitute for his verbal free associations. She interpreted the psychodynamics of the image through the same kind of symbolic register as the word or the gesture, routing them back to what she understood to be the deeper level of unconscious fantasy. Consequently, many of Klein's interpretations throughout the analysis are surprising not only for their blunt, forceful, and rather abrupt delivery, but also because of how they continually read Richard's speech and play, Richard's speech and drawings through a very direct form of symbolism. For Klein, a toy battleship was never just a battleship. In a retrospective interview with Klein's biographer Phyllis Grosskirth in the 1980s, the adult Richard aptly summarized this clinical dynamic himself, saying that he did not remember much from the analysis. However, what he did remember was, quote, going on about the fact that we, the British, were going to bomb the Germans, seize Berlin, and so on, and then Brest. Melanie seized on Brest, B-R-E-A-S-T, which of course was very much her angle. She would often talk about the big mummy genital and the big daddy genital, or the good mummy genital and the bad daddy genital. I can't remember what other things she had to say. It was very much a strong interest in genitalia, end quote. This strong interest in genitalia applied as much to Klein's readings of Richard's drawings as it did to her interpretations of his speech and play. Richard's images were meaningful for Klein because they charted his internal familial conflict, the war inside. But there are, of course, 2 sides to the coin here. Even as it would appear that Klein is, time and again, ahistorically returning Richard's political anxieties to a universalizing mommy-daddy-me triangulation that privileged the European middle-class nuclear family as the seat of all psychic life. In this very gesture, she actually remobilized much of the historically specific war vocabulary that saturated 1940s discourse in Britain. As Richard rehearsed the dynamics of World War II in his play and in his drawings, Klein theorized that children as young as 2 are plagued by unconscious fantasies about, quote, killing, blowing up, ambushing, bombing, invading, attacking the hostile persecutors who appear allied against them. Klein does not date each of the sessions in Narrative of a Child analysis, but her pocketbook records that the span of Richard's analysis witnessed the continued bombing of Northern Ireland, the fall of Greece, the sinking of the Bismarck, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and the bizarre arrival of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's second in command, who bailed out over Glasgow less than 100 miles from Klein. From a historical perspective then, Klein constructs her instinctual phylogenetic unconscious on and through modern European conflict narratives, emblemized by the swing between aggressive attack and ameliorative reparation. During a time of attacks, bombings, and invasions, followed by transnational monetary reparations, Klein's interest was not in the purchase of these phenomena in the external world, but rather in the way that they organized the psychic life of children. As Mahal Shapira compellingly argues in The War Inside, Klein takes the political discourse of World War II and maps it onto and into the mind of the child. It is here that I want to turn to the series of drawings of The Empire that Richard made starting in his 23rd session. And here we have the first. Having previously drawn a marine tableau replete with submarines, battleships, fish, octopi, and starfish, in Richard's Empire drawings, he zooms in on the craggy, irregular shape of the starfish, expanding it to be the full-size subject of no fewer than 22 individual images. Although each of the drawings in the series have slight differences, they all feature a single large star-like shape subdivided into bright, multicolored irregular sections which are traversed by crisscrossing black lines. These subsections are typically filled with 4 colors, red, blue, black, and purple, and are encircled by sharp, shard-like triangles which protrude from around the empire's edges. As Klein describes it, the first of these drawings, quote, started off as the usual big starfish shape, which Richard filled in with colors. He said that this was an empire, and the various colors represented different countries. The black people were horrid and nasty. The light blue and the red were very nice people, and were the ones that the smaller countries did not mind having there. Mrs. K suggested that this empire, again, represented the family, end quote. True to form, Klein found Richard's rendering of empire significant, not because it indexed the rapidly expanding Nazi empire, that harrowing Third Reich that had mere days before successfully invaded Crete, but rather because it symbolized the nuclear family, figured here by distinctly colored and rigidly boundaried territorializations. On Klein's reading, which Richard alternatingly resists and adopts, the quadricolor partitioning of these images hails the Oedipal schema, with good mummy Britain symbolized by light blue, Richard himself represented by red, Brother Paul denoted by the periphery purple, and the bad Hitler daddy signified by the threatening color black. There is clearly much to say here about what Klein implies by so quickly associating the heterosexual family form with the political organization of empire, almost as though she, like Anne Stoller, appreciated that the reproduction of racialized imperial power hinges on the vigilant organization of sexual relations. But in an admittedly psychoanalytic move, I instead want to focus on what is absented from this reading when Klein's analysis of the empire veers so quickly to the pre-established coordinates of nuclear domesticity. For however apt Klein's reading of the psychosexual dynamics of Richard's family may be, it is worth pointing out that such an interpretation avoids considering the possibility that a rapidly expanding genocidal empire could ever be housed as a primal fantasy in the unconscious. By insisting so exclusively on the privacy of the heterosexual family form, Klein's interpretive method elides the idea that empires may have a mind of their own. It neglects, in other words, the possibility that the prototypically patriarchal, racist ordering and management of imperial power might have a primary and structuring effect on the mind, not exactly separate from that to do with the heterosexual family form, but nevertheless recognizably distinct from it. Transforming Klein's interpretive lens thus entails an entirely different theory of subject formation that, if approached socially and historically, would allow us to consider how the political organization of empire was and is anything but secondary and merely symbolic for psychic life. What, I therefore ask, becomes visible if we expand our interpretive lens for reading these images from Klein's principally individual framework to a more social and historical one? What can we see if we read these drawings through an idea of the political unconscious? Considering this same image, one of the things that emerges through this expanded focus is the subtle racialization at play in Richard's representation and narration of the empire. Put in the context of the Nazi glorification of the Aryan race, Richard's comments about how, in his drawing, quote, the Black people were horrid and nasty, end quote, seems clearly to extend a racist discourse characteristic of the project of empire building generally, and of German National Socialism specifically. Although the Jewish, Romani, and Slavic peoples were the primary targets of the Nazis' genocidal final solution, recent research by German historians and critical race scholars like Tina Camp has highlighted how the pervasiveness of accompanying forms of anti-Black racism throughout the Third Reich. It is seen perhaps most famously in the German moral panic that ballooned throughout the interwar period and targeted Allied French African, principally Senegalese soldiers stationed in the Rhineland during World War I. Operating under the Weimar tabloid slogan, quote, the Black Horror on the Rhine, this racial panic represented colonial Black French soldiers as war criminals and rapists, imagining Black masculinity, in a discourse that's all too familiar in a US context, as a violent sexual threat to white German femininity. In spite of the fact that German locals in the Rhineland often had a distinctly favorable opinion of the soldiers, these sensationalized stories continued to spread throughout Germany well into the interwar period, where they became explicitly focused on the status of the so-called Rhineland bastards, or those 400 to 600 mixed-race children that resulted from the relationships between the colonial soldiers and the local German women. Although small in number, these children were the objects of intense racial vitriol as the Nazi Party gained power. As a result, these children were persecuted throughout the 1930s and, in line with Hitler's decree, forcibly sterilized and in some cases disappeared in 1937. Therefore, even as the minority Black populations in Germany were not subject to the same kinds of racist mass murder as the Jewish, Romani, or Slavic peoples, the ideology of anti-Blackness was nevertheless discursively and materially pervasive throughout the interwar and wartime years. Returning to Richard's drawings with this historical context in mind, his description of the Black people qua countries as, quote, horrid and nasty echoes something of the specific Black horror panic in both its language and its content. Through this invocation, Richard's fantasy narrative about his art metabolizes aspects of the racist National Socialist zeitgeist. Yet this is a complicated image, since at the same time as Richard ventriloquizes the tropes of anti-Black racism, he paradoxically assigns these descriptors to the German territories themselves. One way to make sense of this seeming paradox is to read the signifier Black as intensely overdetermined, that is, as a site of potential condensation, which I would contend it invariably is in the case of most 20th century racialized discourse. The Black sections of these images can thus be seen to simultaneously knit together a racialized white supremacist logic with the Nazis' own infamous militarized aesthetic, which made liberal use of Black leather as a signifier of masculinist imperial power. Indeed, Richard himself pays direct homage to the symbolic power that Black military leather has for metonymically representing the Third Reich when he directly incorporates the, quote, big Black Hitler boot into his games, goose-stepping around the consulting room in a mimetic display of Nazi allegiance. In this way, the representation of the expanding Nazi empire through the jagged fractal planes of Black evokes not only the racism Richard narrates, but also the militarized aesthetics of fascism, and even the swastika emblazoned Nazi flag, which Richard often drew. And I think this image is interesting for how it's a combination of the swastika and the empire. Through the overdetermined signifier Black, Richard's art displays a subtle collapse of the discourse of anti-Blackness into the very signifiers of Nazism itself. Yet, as I've been describing, when Klein is presented with these empire images, she shows relatively little interest in their racial or political entanglements. The important yield of the big Black Hitler boot for her is that it leads her back to the, quote, Black Hitler father, which she proposes is the drawing's real referent. Her relative focus on unconscious fantasies about the family means that she never deals directly or openly with the complex racial and political connotations of these images, just as 10 years earlier, in her paper on art and infantile anxiety, Klein sidestepped race when tying reparation to a painting of a, quote, naked negress. Or, just as 10 years later, Winnicott, in his famous Piggle case, did not interrogate the racial dimensions of the Piggle's nocturnal antagonist, quote, Black Mummy. As critical race scholars from Frantz Fanon to Jean Walton, Kalpana Seshadri, and Antonio Viego have all rightly shown, race is often either ignored outright or positioned as a secondary appurtenance in much clinical and theoretical psychoanalytic work. When it comes to Klein specifically, this is a particularly complex illusion since, as a Jewish Austrian living in mid-century England, Klein herself was a racialized subject not afforded the privileges of metropole whiteness, Germanic or British. Read biographically in connection with her own racial identity, it would hardly be a stretch to consider that Klein's affinity for a universalizing psychology was a strategic, if not necessarily intentional, anti-racist bid to reject the kind of desubjectivizing racist discourse with which she herself was threatened. Therefore, even as her work refuses to consider the psychopolitical significance of race, its overall political import is complex, and as post-colonial critics like Edward Said have shown in relation to Freud's work, potentially contradictory. Thinking with this critique, but not for all its explanatory force, necessarily against psychoanalysis as a field of potential, I thus propose that Richard's drawings speak to the complex, non-totalizable entanglement of psychic life with social history. By this, I mean to suggest that while Richard's empires may index the structuring effect of imperialism, racism, and colonialism on the mind, this is not all they do. As an instance of creative aesthetic production, these images also open a space for the subversion and deconstruction of imperial hegemonies, furnishing a precocious critique of empire that addresses itself to the simultaneously to the empires abroad as well as to those at home. So this is the way I'm going to be reading these images. They allow us to imagine, in other words, the anti-colonial capacity of the clinic. So central to my thinking about the decolonial capacity of Richard's empires is the fact that he envisioned them as abstract, non-representational maps. Having been fascinated since his first session with the interwar world map hanging on the wall of the consulting room, a room that Klein rented part-time from the Girl Guides in Scotland, Richard eventually grew frustrated by its outdated representation of the German Empire. Seeking to remedy this, he approaches the map in his 24th session and asks Klein if he could, quote, shade in all the countries which Germany had already taken, end quote, thereby correcting the official cartography with his own art practice. Since it was not her map, Klein said no, leaving Richard no other option but to draw his very own the next day. And this is that image. In this way, Richard links his drawings with the history of imperial cartography, which has long been used as a visual representation of land to assert and codify European dominance. As political tools designed to extend colonial power by giving visual form to what Edward Said calls the imaginative geography of empire, map-making convened a visual regime of power by materializing artificial political boundaries and imposing them on land and indigenous populations alike. According to Anne McClintock, cartography is thus, quote, the servant of colonial plunder, for the knowledge constituted by the map both preceded and legitimized the conquest of territory, end quote. Yet, as I have been saying, however much Richard's empires may cite this history of colonial cartography, their particular content ultimately disrupts any reading of them as unilaterally extending metropolitan imperial itineraries. Because these drawings are crafted through flat planes, bright colors, sharp angles, and fracturing lines, they more accurately mirror the geometric, two-dimensional experiments of modernist visual artists like Picasso, Kandinsky, and even the Bauhaus, whose aesthetics registered the extent to which globalization, world war, and the exhaustion of empire building had begun to fracture the previous Victorian Eurocentric faith in imperial progress, national telos, and psychic unity. By taking four major European metropoles, abstracting them, and fracturing them internally with black lines, the empires do not so much consolidate imperial power as they do deconstruct and subvert it. These proto-modernist renderings of the fractured, jagged metropole thus issue a latent critique of the fantasy of the self-contained and self-sustaining empire form, inviting a perspectival shift on imperial world building. By taking aim at the metropole, here objectified, splayed, divided, and parceled out, Richard's artwork does not simply reify extant colonial holdings. Instead, it visually reimagines them. In a particularly striking enunciation, Richard even declares that part of his intention in producing these images is as a form of political activism against fascism, which is to say, against that latest iteration of European imperial political economy. Quote, "With these I could kill Hitler," Richard declares in his 47th session while waving around colored pencils in the air. For Richard, his art was a direct challenge to fascist imperial expansion. But these drawings importantly take aim at the British Empire as well. Vitally, the empires are multinational conglomerates, which demarcate the bad black German father as much as the good light blue Mummy Britain, the red Russian Empire, and or the purple Belgian Empire. The drawings thus make visible the fact that even if Germany was unequivocally the most dangerous imperial threat in the 1940s, Britain was also itself still an empire, and the world's largest empire at that. To see this, we might think of Richard's 32nd session as he waffles about the, quote, niceness of the expanding Black territories, ultimately concluding that, quote, "It does not matter because Mummy was going to have most of the countries anyway. She already had a lot of them at the center and also a good part of the coast." "Can you see how Mummy has spread herself?" Richard asks Klein. "She has got so much more of the empire now," end quote. Here, the mother and the motherland are rolled into one as Richard's drawing precociously diagnoses the expansiveness of the British Empire as it already existed, which had dominion over many countries, inland and coastal alike. By rendering parallel topographies of empire in black and in blue, Richard's drawings call attention time and again to the imperial itineraries that structured both German fascism and mid-century British social democracy. In other words, if there is an interrogation of empire being enacted here, then my claim is that it is an interrogation that refers not just to the Nazi Empire, but to the British Empire as well. Put in this context, Richard's images of empire raise prescient ethico-political questions about the status of Britain's own imperial project, questions that Britain itself would have to grapple with in the years of decolonization following the war. This is my last paragraph. In taking up Richard's empires and mining them for their political engagement with anti-imperialism, this paper participates in a well-established trend within post-colonial theory that both relies on and critiques psychoanalysis. With just cause, many prominent post-colonial theorists, from Franz Fanon and M. Césaire to Homi Bhabha, Edward Said, and Gayatri Spivak, have exposed psychoanalysis' Eurocentric model of mind, even as they source aspects of its theory to deconstruct the psychic life of oppression. Klein's thinking is no exception here. As I have discussed, her model of mind is in many ways an echo of the political landscape of 20th century Europe. This is perhaps nowhere clearer, if also nowhere more fraught, than in her disturbing 1936 claim that reparation, which Klein understood to be an ethical ideal, is seen in Britain's long and violent history of settler colonialism. She thought that was reparation. In light of this, or perhaps I should say in spite of it, I want to conclude by positing that Richard's empires nevertheless productively resist such neo-colonial scriptings of human psychology. If the rubrics that we use to narrate human psychology have substantial political effects, then part of what I am pursuing here is an understanding of the clinic as also a necessarily political space, one in which both patient and analyst grapple with and through a political unconscious. In this effort, I take inspiration from Fanon, who in 1952 insisted on the necessity of what he called a, quote, combined action in clinical psychoanalysis. Writes Fanon, quote, what emerges is the need for a combined action on the individual and the group. As a psychoanalyst, I must help my patient to no longer be tempted by a hallucinatory lactification, but also to act along the lines of a change in the social structure, end quote. In line with Fanon, I therefore understand Richard's drawings as more than mere child's play, and read them as providing an opening through which to visualize the politicality of the clinic and its anti-imperial, decolonial potentiality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was a really brilliant paper. Before we open up to the audience, I wondered if, Lara, you wanted to respond at all.
I would love to, but I think that we're running low on time. So Carolyn, if you're okay, can we open it up to the audience?
Yes, of course.
I'm gonna bug you outside of this.
I think we should bug each other outside of this.
Okay, we have a comment from David Morgan. Would you like to come online, David?
If David's not there, there are questions in the Q&A too.
Yeah, perhaps I'll read David's question out. So he says, well, comment rather, brilliant talks, but not all analysts have lost their radical roots. Many have been working away in the good old NHS and see people for pro bono work. Do you have a response?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I was implying I sort of like not all people, right? I think that our field overrepresents those who are not doing that work, right? So like, I happen to know David, I know he's doing wonderful work, and that there are many folks who I work alongside with and who have done this thinking work to carry on the sort of legacy of radical psychoanalysis. Unfortunately, the way that power works is that oftentimes those people are not given the same sort of platform. We're thought to be outside. We're thought to live on the periphery. We are experienced as a potential threat to the coherence of psychoanalysis to begin with. And the biggest piece for me is that if we have to quantify and say not all, then it's still not a structural change, right? That we still, as a field, have not taken an ethical imperative stance to unify and sort of come together toward a radical end, the history of which is there for us, and create solidarity to lift up the work that people are doing, rather than sort of piece together. As a graduate student, I was piecing together networks. I was piecing together people who are doing this work, and my training was not representing that.
I don't know if I can also chime in slightly on this point, just because I mean, one of the themes that I think has emerged out of this discussion is about the tension between, or the difference between, practice and theory, and specifically the material manifestation of people who find themselves in professional practice on the one hand, and people who find themselves in the academy on the other. And as I've said repeatedly, I don't work in mental health, but as a lawyer and the kind of law that I do, I repeatedly do encounter mental health professionals. But what's being said by the mental health professionals on the call tonight really resonates with my experience of legal practice, because there's a kind of left-wing liberal approach, sort of left liberal approach, which is to say an approach that is kind of, you know, as I've said, concerned with managing the conflict between labor and capital, but like is really concerned with the workers, you know, and really wants like a welfare state that kind of protects them against the worst excesses of capital without overthrowing capital. And it's sort of, it feels threatened by a critique that says we need to go beyond that. And I suppose what I found really difficult about coming into legal practice was that you're kind of not in Kansas anymore, and the judges there saying, yeah, Mr. McGuinness, your critique of capital and your knowledge of Fanon and stuff is very interesting. The statute says you're wrong and I'm deporting your client to Iraq, which, by the way, was destroyed by the same state that pays my wages, the Home Office's wages, but also your wages, Mr. McGuinness. And it's like, I think Marxists are overrepresented in the academy because it's a nice, safe space where we can kind of think about stuff, and we actually do have meaningful academic tenure, certainly in imperial cores. But when you actually get into practice, you very quickly realize that there's almost no space whatsoever for individual radicalism. It's almost absurd to talk about individually trying to confront something as structural and pervasive as the wage relation, class conflict, empire, imperial violence. And so, you know, I talked briefly in my contribution about this article I'd written for the Materialist Lawyers Group. My impression is that there's a very, very small amount of space within practice that we have the opportunity to expand. But the key point is that if we approach that question of what it means to expand radicalism within our practice on an individual basis, then we've already failed. And what we need to do is to try to think about it in structural terms. And then I suppose the central premise animating, certainly the central thing that excites me about this project that we're trying to forge is that it's not, as I said, just about creating institutions that expand that crack of radicalism, but it's about creating a way of getting up inside existing institutions. And in reality, that's just a way of saying the same thing. We're all within the system of reality. We're all within the system of capitalism. There is no pure place to which we can retreat and regroup from which to launch our kind of morally pure, tactically brilliant critique of capitalism. We're all stuck inside it, and we have to find ways of expanding within existing institutions.
Carolyn, I just wanted to ask you one question about your paper, which was about whether you saw what you described, the political unconscious, as something that works. Sort of, is it an alternative to the unconscious model that Klein puts forward? Is it something that you feel sort of works in tandem with it, or?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. No, I don't think of it as an alternative exactly. I think if I were to give my own preferred answer, it would be what the unconscious was originally theorized as is a political unconscious. I suppose that's my reading of the way I understand the unconscious is as a social and political unconscious. But I do think that within, I mean, we could think this through Elizabeth Danto's work, which Lara really helpfully referenced, or just kind of interpretations of the movement of the history of psychoanalysis. But I do think that there is a story about psychoanalysis that I'm persuaded by, that kind of thinks about psychoanalysis's origins as radical, and then especially in the mid-century movement and exodus of analysts out of kind of all of the territories that were invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany, that there was a kind of retrenchment of and a conservatization of psychoanalysis. And the story gets told in the migration of psychoanalysts to London, but also importantly in the migration of psychoanalysts to the United States, where virtues like assimilation and security start to become the keynote kind of ideology of psychoanalysis. And you could see this not just in Anna Freud, who gets picked up on a lot, who's very interested in authority, but you could see this in John Bowlby's work and his kind of attachment to security discourses, which I write a bit about. So if we think with that history, then one of the things that we can see happening through people like Klein's work, et cetera, is a closing down of what an idea of the unconscious could hold. So when I'm proposing a political unconscious, I'm almost secretly thinking to myself that, yes, this is what the unconscious can allow us to do and to think. This is a kind of version of the unconscious that I would want to back, and one that, might have been more enabled in an earlier historical moment where psychoanalysis was operating with different constraints and in a very different political economy.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question here from Nick. He asks, how does one reconcile the interests of mental health workers in a radical practice, i.e. working 4 days, with the demands of clients wanting to access the service at a time that fits around them and their responsibility? So a more practical question.
So I would say that that's an excellent question, and one that allows us to think about the necessity of speaking to the structure, sort of like what Frank was just saying, is that the reasons why folks might need to access at certain times is because it's a sort of like an epistemological question, like why are the conditions such that they are, right? That folks in the context of the United States work until 5 or 6 p.m. They need to see their therapists after that time frame, or on weekends because they're overworked during the week. I think if that is nothing to tell us that that is what we need to be speaking to, that the conditions of a capitalist world and a sort of exploitative labor creates also the urgency around specific timeframes versus the flexibility of folks attending to when they are at their best to be seen. The other thing that I might say is that if we have a system that takes care of people, that urgency and immediacy of needing to meet, or that is constantly within the realm of mental health, kind of also fades away. That we might think and re-envision a world in which the community can also take care of some of the things that now come to live within the clinical space, that only clinicians, right? And clinicians play into this too. Our sort of arrogance around like our expertise is ours and we hoard it, rather than despecialize our knowledge and really allow folks access to that knowledge, whether or not that's in the space of the clinic, right? My flexibility, like building a world and a practice that's flexible to be able to attend to the needs of the folks that I work with, is central in that. And I'm only able to do that because I've pieced together a kind of practice that includes academia, policy working, and all that. The fact that I have to do that to then become accessible to folks tells us about the structural issues that are involved in attending to it. And when I'm able to have those conversations with the people that I work with, I think together we can think about some of the limitations that naturally come by being subjects within these larger oppressive structures, and how those themselves also perpetuate disorder, right? So it's not just located within the person. It's not just like the person's urgency or like, I need to see you all the time, or neediness or whatever that's involved. Is how are these larger structures coming to play that both of us now are having to negotiate a time frame that usually folks that come into therapy at around 6 or 7 p.m. are also exhausted, right? Are they doing their best work? Are we able to really provide them the framework and the space to do the best work when they're coming in exhausted and then having to go and attend to their personal lives? Or what we also suggest that people engage in self-care. Where is there self-care in a world that demands every moment, right? That literally bleeds you dry of every moment. So I think that is the piece that this question for me can't be answered without also committing ourselves to structural analysis and committing ourselves to working towards that as a way to work towards mental wellness, mental health wellness for folks.
Yeah, if I can just jump in again, and echoing what you said, Laura, like I think that, well, I have a few things that I think about this. I mean, like, number one is that, my experience of doing trade unionism at a radical-based trade union, often underfunded, is that there can be a kind of unhealthy burnout culture pursuant to which you have to, you almost have to drag your conditions down to the worst conditions of the people you're organizing with, in order to justify what you're doing, and it becomes entirely self-defeating. I don't think that's good praxis at all. I don't think that trade unionists should be working 6 or 7 days a week. I think we should be creating counter-hegemonic praxis, and that actually will be better at fighting capitalism and specifically at organizing workers against bosses if we start to create a radically counter-hegemonic way of doing things, and specifically if we start to reduce the working week. But I do appreciate that it creates a tension. I think the other thing to say is that my experience, again, of legal practice, and I'm fairly sure that this will be mirrored in clinical practice, medical, mental health practice, but comrades who know more about this than me can correct me, is that, you know, legal aid barristers, as we call them in England, are paid loads of money, right? That's an unpopular thing for me to say, because the Daily Mail attacks legal aid as a branch of the welfare state. It attacks the idea that poor people should have free access or subsidized access to vital legal services that keep them in the country, keep them out of prison, keep them in their homes. You know, this is important stuff, and yet the fact remains that a lot of those barristers are paid really well. And so I think the answer starts to become, well, actually, it is possible for at least some of the people in the legal sector to work, to go down to 4 days a week and to still be providing their vital functions as far as the question of their wages are concerned. And what becomes more interesting to me then is that if you go into a lot of these legal aid firms, there's an awful lot of excess capital that could be redistributed into creating additional jobs. And that's exactly how you do it. You create a kind of rotational system that sort of says, yeah, we need to provide cover basically 7 days a week. There's emergency clinical care that's needed. And what we need is to finance the wages necessary to ensure that someone is always there, but not just someone, but someone who's well rested, someone who's on a 4-day week themselves. So they've had 3 days to recuperate, to recover from the emotional labor of trying to provide, you know, medical solidarity to people who need it. And so I think that does raise a broader question. And the thing that's ambitious about our project is that we're trying to marry it to an economically robust critique of the capitalist political economy as a whole. And it's not a coincidence that we've started in places like law, places like clinical practice. London Learning Cooperative has started in places like education, where there's a pre-existing market for private tuition, where people already have a lot of money to throw at these kind of projects, which is why we're able to generate these surpluses, collectively generate these surpluses through our labor power, and then collectively redistribute the surpluses. But the point is, what do you do when you start to get to the proper, you know, peripheral kind of industries? What do you do when you get to a garment worker in Bangladesh, where the profit margins are already so thin that that's why they're being made to work 14-hour days in a sweatshop for starvation wages? Because that's the only way that the capitalist system can extract profit from that business model, is by like driving the proper super exploited working class, driving their working conditions into the basement, right, into the dirt. And so that's why we started with the critique of empire, is because that's absolutely vital.
I'm conscious, sorry to interrupt you. We were just coming towards the end. There's a question from Hazel that I wanted to put to the panelists. Hazel writes, in the UK, it seems that treatments are becoming more individualized and shorter term, reflecting the intensification of neoliberalism. From the point of view of a client of NHS mental health services rather than a practitioner, I've experienced a democratically run therapeutic community that incorporates DBT and various forms of psychoanalysis in intensive group work. This was shut down due to austerity measures, and CBT is being promoted much more within the same sector of services. What can we do as non-professionals to build psychoanalytic group work within our lives? How does social reproduction fit into this? Does the workplace organising extend beyond the professional boundary, or how hard is that boundary?
That's an awesome question. So I actually fits into that. We had an anonymous question about like how do like mental health nurses and all of that fit into that. And I would answer it this in the same breath, is that we need everybody on board for this, right? And I think the demarcation between specialists or non-specialists is a really important thing here, because on the one hand, that's also used to exclude and also put parameters around knowledge production, right? So what I would say to you, Hazel, is that your knowledge is just as valid as the knowledge that we might create in a clinical space. And so to come together as sort of patients or clients and forge solidarity networks with mental health clinicians to work towards this, and against the sort of hegemony of sort of short-term work, not because the short-term work in and of itself doesn't work, but because of what the short-term work is actually working to displace, right? So it's not that CBT doesn't work for some folks, it's that CBT is used as a weapon against long-term work to displace a sort of more in-depth work that does not want to be, that nobody wants to fund. And that also props up a racist attitude of that, which CBT, if we see from like help organizations or NGOs, that CBT is always used or more likely to be used, particularly within trauma, because of the assumption that folks in colonial spaces especially don't have an internal world to work. And so let's just give them behavioral processes. So when we come together with a sort of larger structural reading of why these certain modalities come to be more salient than others, specialists, non-specialists, all of us together in a solidarity network to demand that folks actually get access to the level of care and the depth of care that they deserve, and that would uphold the dignity of human process, particularly in the world under capitalism. Right? That if now we don't need something that's in depth and allows us to sort of analyze our own positions within larger structures, CBT is not going to allow you to do that. CBT is going to tell you, how do you function within this fucked up system, right? In a way that manages symptoms that sometimes might be necessary for survival. But if we can all come together in terms of a solidarity network, which is how I see this project as beginning, right? A sort of call to folks to join on board and saying, how can we create solidarity networks across the board to envision a new way of taking up mental health issues that includes both the worker and the people that we might work with or for.
Right, I'm just aware that we've come to the end now. I'm just seeing if there were any other questions. Or if any of the panel wanted to say any final words. No, okay, we'll finish there then. Thank you very much to Dr. Lara Sheehan and Dr. Carolyn Lawbender. We'll be having another event in about a month's time. We'll keep you informed on the social media platforms about that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Have a good evening.
Yeah.